The Bull by Saki. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Schampf. The Bull. Tom Yorkfield had always regarded his half-brother Lawrence with a lazy instinct of dislike, toned down as years went on to a tolerant feeling of indifference. There was nothing very tangible to dislike him for. He was just a blood relation with whom Tom had no single taste or interest in common, and with whom, at the same time, he had had no occasion for quarrel. Lawrence had left the farm early in life, and had lived for a few years on a small sum of money left him by his mother. He had taken up painting as a profession, and was reported to be doing fairly well at it, well enough, at any rate, to keep body and soul together. He specialized in painting animals, and he was successful in finding a certain number of people to buy his pictures. Tom felt a comforting sense of assured superiority in contrasting his position with that of his half-brother. Lawrence was an artist chap, just that and nothing more, though you might make it sound more important by calling him an animal painter. Tom was a farmer. Not in a very big way, it was true, but the Helsery farm had been in the family for some generations, and it had a good reputation for the stock raised on it. Tom had done his best, with the little capital at his command, to maintain and improve the standard of his small herd of cattle, and in Clover Fairy he had bred a bull which was something rather better than any of his immediate neighbours could show. It would not have made a sensation in the judging ring at an important cattle show, but it was as vigorous, shapely, and healthy a young animal as any small practical farmer could wish to possess. At the King's Head on market days, Clover Fairy was very highly spoken of, and Yorkfield used to declare that he would not part with him for £100. £100 is a lot of money in the small farming line, and probably anything over 80 would have tempted him. It was with some especial pleasure that Tom took advantage of one of Lawrence's rare visits to the farm to lead him down to the enclosure where Clover Fairy kept solitary state, the grass widower of a grazing harem. Tom felt some of his old dislike for his half-brother reviving. The artist was becoming more languid in his manner, more unsuitably turned out in attire, and he seemed inclined to impart a slightly patronizing tone to his conversation. He took no heed of a flourishing potato crop, but waxed enthusiastic over a clump of yellow flowering weed that stood in a corner by a gateway, which was rather galling to the owner of a really very well-weeded farm. Again, when he might have been duly complimentary about a group of fat black-faced lambs that simply cried aloud for admiration, he became eloquent over the foliage tints of an oak copse on the hill opposite. But now he was being taken to inspect the crowning pride and glory of Helsery, however grudging he might be in his praises, however backward and niggardly with his congratulations. He would have to see and acknowledge the many excellences of that redoubtable animal. Some weeks ago, while on a business journey to Taunton, Tom had been invited by his half-brother to visit a studio in that town, where Lawrence was exhibiting one of his pictures. A large canvas representing a bull standing knee-deep in some marshy ground. It had been good of its kind, no doubt, and Lawrence had seemed inordinately pleased with it. "The best thing I've done yet," he said over and over again, and Tom had generously agreed that it was fairly lifelike. Now, the man of pigments was going to be shown a real picture, a living model of strength and comeliness, a thing to feast the eyes on. A picture that exhibited new pose and action with every shifting minute, instead of standing glued into one unvarying attitude between the four walls of a frame. Tom unfastened a stout wooden door and led the way into a straw-bedded yard. "Is he quiet?" asked the artist, as the young bull with a curly red coat came inquiringly towards them. "He's playful at times," said Tom, leaving his half-brother to wonder whether the bull's ideas of play were of the catch-as-catch-can order. Lawrence made one or two perfunctory comments on the animal's appearance, and asked a question or so as to his age and such-like details. Then he coolly turned the talk into another channel. "Do you remember the picture I showed you at Taunton?" he asked. "Yes," grunted Tom. a white-faced bull standing in some slush. Don't admire those Herefords much myself. Bulky-looking brutes. Don't seem to have much life in them. Daresay they're easier to paint that way. Now this young beggar is on the move all the time. Aren't you, Fairy?" "I've sold that picture," said Lawrence, with considerable complacency in his voice. "Have you?" said Tom. "Glad to hear it, I'm sure. Hope you're pleased with what you got for it." "I got £300 for it," said Lawrence. Tom turned towards him with a slowly rising flush of anger in his face. £300! Under the most favourable market conditions that he could imagine, his prized Clover Fairy would hardly fetch 100. Yet here was a piece of varnished canvas, painted by his half-brother, selling for 3 times that sum. It was a cruel insult that went home with all the more force because it emphasized the triumph of the patronizing, self-satisfied Lawrence. The young farmer had meant to put his relative just a little out of conceit with himself by displaying the jewel of his possessions. And now the tables were turned, and his valued beast was made to look cheap and insignificant beside the price paid for a mere picture. It was so monstrously unjust. The painting would never be anything more than a dexterous piece of counterfeit life, while Clover Fairy was the real thing, a monarch in his little world, a personality in the countryside. After he was dead even, he would still be something of a personality. His descendants would graze in those valley meadows and hillside pastures. They would fill stall and byre and milking shed. Their good red coats would speckle the landscape and crowd the market-place. Men would note a promising heifer or a well-proportioned steer and say, "Ah, that one comes of good old Clover Fairy's stock." All that time the picture would be hanging, lifeless and unchanging, beneath its dust and varnish, a chattel that ceased to mean anything if you chose to turn it with its back to the wall. These thoughts chased themselves angrily through Tom Yorkfield's mind, but he could not put them into words. When he gave tongue to his feelings, he put matters bluntly and harshly. "Some soft-witted fool may like to throw away £300 on a bit of paintwork. Can't say as I envy them their taste. I'd rather have the real thing than a picture of it." He nodded towards the young bull that was alternately staring at them with nose held high and lowering its horns with a half-playful, half-impatient shake of the head. Lawrence laughed a laugh of irritating, indulgent amusement. "I don't think the purchaser of my bit of paintwork, as you call it, need worry about having thrown his money away. As I get to be better known and recognized, my pictures will go up in value. That particular one will probably fetch 400 in a sale room 5 or 6 years hence. Pictures aren't a bad investment if you know enough to pick out the work of the right men. Now you can't say your precious bull is going to get more valuable the longer you keep him. He'll have his little day, and then, if you go on keeping him, he'll come down at last to a few shillings' worth of hoofs and hide, just at a time, perhaps, when my bull is being bought for a big sum for some important picture gallery." It was too much. The united force of truth and slander and insult put over heavy a strain on Tom Yorkfield's powers of restraint. In his right hand he held a useful oak cudgel. With his left he made a grab at the loose collar of Lawrence's canary-coloured silk shirt. Lawrence was not a fighting man. The fear of physical violence threw him off his balance as completely as overmastering indignation had thrown Tom off his. And thus it came to pass that Clover Fairy was regaled with the unprecedented sight of a human being scudding and squawking across the enclosure, like the hen that would persist in trying to establish a nesting place in the manger. In another crowded, happy moment, the bull was trying to jerk Lawrence over his left shoulder, to prod him in the ribs while still in the air, and to kneel on him when he reached the ground. It was only the vigorous intervention of Tom that induced him to relinquish the last item of his programme. Tom devotedly and ungrudgingly nursed his half-brother to a complete recovery from his injuries, which consisted of nothing more serious than a dislocated shoulder, a broken rib or two, and a little nervous prostration. After all, there was no further occasion for rancour in the young farmer's mind. Lawrence's bull might sell for 300 or for 600, and be admired by thousands in some big picture gallery, but it would never toss a man over one shoulder and catch him a jab in the ribs before he had fallen on the other side. That was Clover Fairy's noteworthy achievement, which could never be taken away from him. Lawrence continues to be popular as an animal artist, but his subjects are always kittens or fawns or lambkins, never bulls. End of the Bull by Saki.
The Adventure of Charles Augustus Milverton by Arthur Conan Doyle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Tomlinson. It is years since the incidents of which I speak took place, and yet it is with diffidence that I allude to them. For a long time, even with the utmost discretion and reticence, it would have been impossible to make the facts public, but now the principal person concerned is beyond the reach of human law, and with due suppression the story may be told in such fashion as to injure no one. It records an absolutely unique experience in the career both of Mr. Sherlock Holmes and of myself. The reader will excuse me if I conceal the date or any other fact by which he might trace the actual occurrence. We had been out for one of our evening rambles, Holmes and I, and had returned about 6 o'clock on a cold, frosty winter's evening. As Holmes turned up the lamp, the light fell upon a card on the table. He glanced at it, and then, with an ejaculation of disgust, threw it on the floor. I picked it up and read, Charles Augustus Milverton, Appledore Towers, Hampstead. Agent. "Who is he?" I asked. "The worst man in London," Holmes answered as he sat down and stretched his legs before the fire. "Is anything on the back of the card?" I turned it over. "We'll call at 6:30 c.a.m." I read. He's about due. Do you feel a creeping, shrinking sensation, Watson, when you stand before the serpents in the zoo and see the slithery, gliding, venomous creatures with their deadly eyes and wicked, flattened faces? Well, that's how Milverton impresses me. I've had to do with 50 murderers in my career, but the worst of them never gave me the repulsion which I have for this fellow. And yet I can't get out of doing business with him. Indeed, he is here at my invitation. But who is he? I'll tell you, Watson. He is the king of all the blackmailers. Heaven help the man, and still more the woman, whose secret and reputation come into the power of Milverton. With a smiling face and a heart of marble, he will squeeze and squeeze until he has drained them dry. The fellow is a genius in his way, and would have made his mark in some more savoury trade. His method is as follows. He allows it to be known that he is prepared to pay very high sums for letters which compromise people of wealth or position. He receives these wares not only from treacherous valets or maids, but frequently from genteel ruffians who have gained the confidence and affection of trusting women. He deals with no niggard hand. I happen to know that he paid £700 to a footman for a note 2 lines in length, and that the ruin of a noble family was the result. Everything which is in the market goes to Milverton, and there are hundreds in this great city who turn white at his name. No one knows where his grip may fall, for he is far too rich and far too cunning to work from hand to mouth. He will hold a card back for years in order to play it at the moment when the stake is best worth winning. I said that he is the worst man in London, and I would ask you, how could one compare the ruffian who in hot blood bludgeons his mate with this man, who methodically and at his leisure tortures the soul and wrings the nerves in order to add to his already swollen money-bags? I had seldom heard my friend speak with such intensity of feeling. "But surely," said I, "the fellow must be within the grasp of the law." "Technically, no doubt, but practically not. What would it profit a woman, for example, to get him a few months' imprisonment if her own ruin must immediately follow? His victims dare not hit back. If ever he blackmailed an innocent person, then indeed we should have him, but he is as cunning as the evil one. No, no, we must find other ways to fight him. And why is he here? Because an illustrious client has placed her piteous case in my hands. It is the Lady Eva Brackwell, the most beautiful debutante of last season. She is to be married in a fortnight to the Earl of Dovercourt. This fiend has several imprudent letters. Imprudent, Watson, nothing worse, which were written to an impecunious young squire in the country. They would suffice to break off the match. Milverton will send the letters to the Earl unless a large sum of money is paid him. I have been commissioned to meet him and to make the best terms I can. At that instant there was a clatter and a rattle in the street below. Looking down, I saw a stately carriage and pair, the brilliant lamps gleaming on the glossy haunches of the noble chestnuts. A footman opened the door, and a small, stout man in a shaggy astrakhan overcoat descended. A minute later he was in the room. Charles Augustus Milverton was a man of 50, with a large, intellectual head, a round, plump, hairless face, a perpetual frozen smile, and two keen grey eyes which gleamed brightly from behind broad, gold-rimmed glasses. There was something of Mr. Pickwick's benevolence in his appearance, marred only by the insincerity of the fixed smile and by the hard glitter of those restless and penetrating eyes. His voice was as smooth and suave as his countenance, as he advanced with a plump little hand extended, murmuring his regret for having missed us at his first visit. Holmes disregarded the outstretched hand and looked at him with a face of granite. Milverton's smile broadened. He shrugged his shoulders, removed his overcoat, folded it with great deliberation over the back of a chair, and then took a seat. "This gentleman," said he, with a wave in my direction. "Is it discreet? Is it right?" "Dr. Watson is my friend and partner." "Very good, Mr. Holmes. It is only in your client's interest that I protested. The matter is so very delicate. Dr. Watson has already heard of it." "Then we can proceed to business. You say that you are acting for Lady Eva. Has she empowered you to accept my terms?" "What are your terms?" £7,000. "And the alternative?" "My dear sir, it is painful for me to discuss it, but if the money is not paid on the 14th, there certainly will be no marriage on the 18th. His insufferable smile was more complacent than ever. Holmes thought for a little. "You appear to me," he said at last, "to be taking matters too much for granted. I am, of course, familiar with the contents of these letters. My client will certainly do what I may advise. I shall counsel her to tell her future husband the whole story and to trust to his generosity." Milverton chuckled. "You evidently do not know the Earl," said he. From the baffled look upon Holmes's face I could see clearly that he did. "What harm is there in the letters?" he asked. "They are sprightly, very sprightly," Milverton answered. "The lady was a charming correspondent, but I can assure you that the Earl of Dovercourt would fail to appreciate them. However, since you think otherwise, we will let it rest at that. It is purely a matter of business. If you think that it is in the best interest of your client that these letters should be placed in the hands of the Earl, then you would indeed be foolish to pay so large a sum of money to regain them." He rose and seized his astrakhan coat. Holmes was grey with anger and mortification. "Wait a little," he said. "You go too fast. We would certainly make every effort to avoid scandal in so delicate a matter." Milverton relapsed into his chair. "I was sure that you would see it in that light," he purred. "At the same time," Holmes continued, "Lady Eva is not a wealthy woman. I assure you that £2,000 would be a drain upon her resources, and that the sum you name is utterly beyond her power. I beg, therefore, that you will moderate your demands, and that you will return the letters at the price I indicate, which is, I assure you, the highest that you can get." Milverton's smile broadened and his eyes twinkled humorously. "I'm aware that what you say is true about the lady's resources," said he. "At the same time, you must admit that the occasion of a lady's marriage is a very suitable time for her friends and relatives to make some little effort upon her behalf. They may hesitate as to an acceptable wedding present. Let me assure them that this little bundle of letters will give them more joy than all the candelabra and butter dishes in London." "It is impossible," said Holmes. Dear me, how unfortunate!" cried Milverton, taking out a bulky pocket-book. "I cannot help thinking that ladies are ill-advised in not making an effort. Look at this." He held up a little note with a coat of arms upon the envelope. "That belongs to, well, perhaps it is hardly fair to tell the name until tomorrow morning, but at that time it will be in the hands of the lady's husband. And all because she will not find a beggarly sum which you could get by turning her diamonds into paste. It is such a pity. Now you remember the sudden end of the engagement between the Honourable Miss Miles and Colonel Dorking. Only 2 days before the wedding there was a paragraph in the Morning Post to say that it was all off. And why? It is almost incredible, but the absurd sum of £1,200 would have settled the whole question. Is it not pitiful? And here I find you, a man of sense, boggling about terms when your client's future and honour are at stake. You surprise me, Mr. Holmes." "What I say is true," Holmes answered. "The money cannot be found. Surely it is better for you to take the substantial sum which I offer than to ruin this woman's career, which can profit you in no way." "There you make a mistake, Mr. Holmes. An exposure would profit me indirectly to a considerable extent. I have 8 or 10 similar cases maturing. If it was circulated among them that I had made a severe example of the Lady Eva, I should find all of them much more open to reason. You see my point?" Holmes sprang from his chair. "Get behind him, Watson. Don't let him out. Now, sir, let us see the contents of that notebook." Milverton had glided as quick as a rat to the side of the room, and stood with his back against the wall. Mr. Holmes," he said, turning the front of his coat and exhibiting the butt of a large revolver, which projected from the inside pocket. "I have been expecting you to do something original. This has been done so often, and what good has ever come from it? I assure you that I am armed to the teeth, and I am perfectly prepared to use my weapons, knowing that the law will support me. Besides, your supposition that I would bring the letters here in a notebook is entirely mistaken. I would do nothing so foolish. And now, gentlemen, I have 1 or 2 little interviews this evening, and it is a long drive to Hampstead." He stepped forward, took up his coat, laid his hand on his revolver, and turned to the door. I picked up a chair, but Holmes shook his head and I laid it down again. With a bow, a smile, and a twinkle, Milverton was out of the room, and a few moments after we heard the slam of the carriage door and the rattle of the wheels as he drove away. Holmes sat motionless by the fire, his hands buried deep in his trouser pockets, his chin sunk upon his breast, his eyes fixed upon the glowing embers. For half an hour he was silent and still. Then, with the gesture of a man who has taken his decision, he sprang to his feet and passed into his bedroom. A little later a rakish young workman with a goatee beard and a swagger lit his clay pipe at the lamp before descending into the street. "I'll be back some time, Watson," said he, and vanished into the night. I understood that he had opened his campaign against Charles Augustus Milverton, but I little dreamed the strange shape which that campaign was destined to take. For some days Holmes came and went at all hours in this attire, but beyond a remark that his time was spent at Hampstead, and that it was not wasted, I knew nothing of what he was doing. At last, however, on a wild, tempestuous evening, when the wind screamed and rattled against the windows, he returned from his last expedition, and having removed his disguise, he sat before the fire and laughed heartily in his silent inward fashion. "You would not call me a marrying man, Watson?" "No, indeed." "You'll be interested to hear that I am engaged." "My dear fellow, I congrat to Milverton's housemaid." "Good heavens, Holmes!" "I wanted information, Watson." "Surely you have gone too far." "It was a most necessary step. I am a plumber with a rising business, Escott by name. I have walked out with her each evening, and I have talked with her. Good heavens, those talks! However, I have got all I wanted. I know Milverton's house as I know the palm of my hand. But the girl, Holmes. He shrugged his shoulders. You can't help it, my dear Watson. You must play your cards as best you can when such a stake is on the table. However, I rejoice to say that I have a hated rival who will certainly cut me out the instant that my back is turned. What a splendid night it is! You like this weather? It suits my purpose, Watson. I mean to burgle Milverton's house tonight. I had a catching of the breath, and my skin went cold at the words, which were slowly uttered in a tone of concentrated resolution. As a flash of lightning in the night shows up in an instant every detail of a wide landscape, so at one glance I seemed to see every possible result of such an action: the detection, the capture, the honoured career ending in irreparable failure and disgrace, my friend himself lying at the mercy of the odious Milverton. "For heaven's sake, Holmes, think what you are doing!" I cried. "My dear fellow, I've given it every consideration. I am never precipitate in my actions, nor would I adopt so energetic and indeed so dangerous a course if any other were possible. Let us look at the matter clearly and fairly. I suppose that you will admit that the action is morally justifiable, though technically criminal. To burgle his house is no more than to forcibly take his pocket-book, an action in which you were prepared to aid me." I turned it over in my mind. "Yes," I said, "it is morally justifiable so long as our object is to take no articles save those which are used for an illegal purpose." "Exactly. Since it is morally justifiable, I have only to consider the question of personal risk. Surely a gentleman should not lay much stress upon this when a lady is in most desperate need of help. You will be in such a false position." "Well, that is part of the risk. There is no other possible way of regaining these letters. The unfortunate lady has not the money, and there are none of her people in whom she could confide. Tomorrow is the last day of grace, and unless we can get the letters tonight, this villain will be as good as his word and will bring about her ruin. I must, therefore, abandon my client to her fate, or I must play this last card. Between ourselves, Watson, it's a sporting duel between this fellow Milverton and me. He had, as you saw, the best of the first exchanges, but my self-respect and my reputation are concerned to fight it to a finish." "Well, I don't like it, but I suppose it must be," said I. "When do we start?" "You are not coming." "Then you are not going," said I. "I give you my word of honour, and I never broke it in my life, that I will take a cab straight to the police station and give you away unless you let me share this adventure with you." "You can't help me." "How do you know that?" "You can't tell what may happen. Anyway, my resolution is taken. Other people beside you have self-respect and even reputations." Holmes had looked annoyed, but his brow cleared, and he clapped me on the shoulder. "Well, well, my dear fellow, be it so. We have shared the same room for some years, and it would be amusing if we ended by sharing the same cell. You know, Watson, I don't mind confessing to you that I have always had an idea that I would have made a highly efficient criminal. This is the chance of my lifetime in that direction. See here." He took a neat little leather case out of a drawer, and opening it he exhibited a number of shining instruments. "This is a first-class, up-to-date burgling kit, with nickel-plated jemmy, diamond-tipped glass cutter, adaptable keys, and every modern improvement which the march of civilization demands. Here, too, is my dark lantern. Everything is in order. Have you a pair of silent shoes?" "I have rubber-soled tennis shoes." "Excellent. And a mask?" "I can make a couple out of black silk." "I can see that you have a strong natural turn for this sort of thing." "Very good. Do you make the masks? We have some cold supper before we start. It is now 9:30. At 11 we shall drive as far as Church Row. It is a quarter of an hour's walk from there to Appledore Towers. We shall be at work before midnight. Milverton is a heavy sleeper and retires punctually at 10:30. With any luck we shall be back here by 2 with the Lady Eva's letters in my pocket. Holmes and I put on our dress clothes so that we might appear to be two theatre-goers homeward bound. In Oxford Street we picked up a hansom and drove to an address in Hampstead. Here we paid off our cab, and with our greatcoats buttoned up, for it was bitterly cold, and the wind seemed to blow through us, we walked along the edge of the heath. "It is a business that needs delicate treatment," said Holmes. "These documents are contained in a safe in the fellow's study, and the study is the ante-room of his bedchamber. On the other hand, like all these stout little men, who do themselves well, he is a plethoric sleeper. Agatha, that's my fiancée, says it is a joke in the servants' hall that it's impossible to wake the master. He has a secretary who is devoted to his interests and never budges from the study all day. That's why we are going at night. Then he has a beast of a dog which roams the garden. I met Agatha late the last 2 evenings, and she locks the brute up so as to give me a clear run. This is the house, this big one in its own grounds. Through the gate, now to the right among the laurels. We might put on our masks here, I think. You see, there is not a glimmer of light in any of the windows, and everything is working splendidly. With our black silk face coverings, which turned us into two of the most truculent figures in London, we stole up to the silent, gloomy house. A sort of tiled veranda extended along one side of it, lined by several windows and 2 doors. "That's his bedroom," Holmes whispered. "This door opens straight into the study. It would suit us best, but it is bolted as well as locked, and we should make too much noise getting in. Come round here. There's a greenhouse which opens into the drawing-room." The place was locked, but Holmes removed a circle of glass and turned the key from the inside. An instant afterwards he had closed the door behind us, and we had become felons in the eyes of the law. The thick, warm air of the conservatory and the rich, choking fragrance of exotic plants took us by the throat. He seized my hand in the darkness and led me swiftly past banks of shrubs which brushed against our faces. Holmes had remarkable powers, carefully cultivated, of seeing in the dark. Still holding my hand in one of his, he opened a door, and I was vaguely conscious that we had entered a large room in which a cigar had been smoked not long before. He felt his way among the furniture, opened another door, and closed it behind us. Putting out my hand, I felt several coats hanging from the wall, and I understood that I was in a passage. We passed along it, and Holmes very gently opened the door upon the right-hand side. Something rushed out at us, and my heart sprang into my mouth, but I could have laughed when I realized that it was the cat. A fire was burning in this new room, and again the air was heavy with tobacco smoke. Holmes entered on tiptoe, waited for me to follow, and then very gently closed the door. We were in Milverton's study, and a portière at the farthest side showed the entrance to his bedroom. It was a good fire, and the room was illuminated by it. Near the door I saw the gleam of an electric switch, but it was unnecessary, even if it had been safe, to turn it on. At one side of the fireplace was a heavy curtain, which covered the bay window we had seen from the outside. On the other side was the door which communicated with the veranda. A desk stood in the centre, with a turning chair of shining red leather. Opposite was a large bookcase with a marble bust of Athene on top of it. In the corner between the bookcase and the wall there stood a tall green safe, the firelight flashing back from the polished brass knobs upon its face. Holmes stole across and looked at it. Then he crept to the door of the bedroom and stood with slanting head listening intently. No sound came from within. Meanwhile it had struck me that it would be wise to secure our retreat through the outer door, so I examined it. To my amazement, it was neither locked nor bolted. I touched Holmes on the arm, and he turned his masked face in that direction. I saw him start, and he was evidently as surprised as I. "I don't like it," he whispered, putting his lips to my very ear. "I can't quite make it out. Anyhow, we have no time to lose. Can I do anything?" "Yes. Stand by the door. If you hear anyone come, bolt it on the inside, and we can get away as we came. If they come the other way, we can get through the door if our job is done, or hide behind these window curtains if it is not. Do you understand?" I nodded and stood by the door. My first feeling of fear had passed away, and I thrilled now with a keener zest than I'd ever enjoyed when we were the defenders of the law instead of its defiers. The high object of our mission, the consciousness that it was unselfish and chivalrous, the villainous character of our opponent, all added to the sporting interest of the adventure. Far from feeling guilty, I rejoiced and exulted in our danger. With a glow of admiration, I watched Holmes unrolling his case of instruments and choosing his tool with the calm scientific accuracy of a surgeon who performs a delicate operation. I knew that the opening of safes was a particular hobby with him, and I understood the joy which it gave him to be confronted with this green and gold monster, the dragon which held in its maw the reputations of many fair ladies. Turning up the cuffs on his dress coat, he had placed his overcoat on a chair. Holmes laid out 2 drills, a jemmy, and several skeleton keys. I stood at the centre door with my eyes glancing at each of the others, ready for any emergency, though indeed my plans were somewhat vague as to what I should do if we were interrupted. For half an hour Holmes worked with concentrated energy, laying down one tool, picking up another, handling each with the strength and delicacy of the trained mechanic. Finally I heard a click. The broad green door swung open, and inside I had a glimpse of a number of paper packets, each tied, sealed, and inscribed. Holmes picked one out, but it was hard to read by the flickering fire, and he drew out his little dark lantern, for it was too dangerous, with Milverton in the next room, to switch on the electric light. Suddenly I saw him halt, listen intently, and then in an instant he had swung the door of the safe to, picked up his coat, stuffed his tools into the pockets, and darted behind the window curtain, motioning me to do the same. It was only when I had joined him there that I heard what had alarmed his quicker senses. There was a noise somewhere within the house. A door slammed in the distance. Then a confused, dull murmur broke itself into the measured thud of heavy footsteps rapidly approaching. They were in the passage outside the room. They paused at the door. The door opened. There was a sharp snick as the electric light was turned on. The door closed once more, and the pungent reek of a strong cigar was borne to our nostrils. Then the footsteps continued backwards and forwards, within a few yards of us. Finally, there was a creak from a chair, and the footsteps ceased. Then a key clicked in a lock, and I heard the rustle of papers. So far I had not dared to look out, but now I gently parted the division of the curtains in front of me and peeped through. From the pressure of Holmes's shoulder against mine, I knew that he was sharing my observations. Right in front of us, and almost within our reach, was the broad, rounded back of Milverton. It was evident that we had entirely miscalculated his movements, and he had never been to his bedroom, but that he had been sitting up in some smoking or billiard room in the farther wing of the house, the windows of which we had not seen. His broad, grizzled head, with its shining patch of baldness, was in the immediate foreground of our vision. He was leaning far back in the red leather chair, his legs outstretched, a long black cigar projecting at an angle from his mouth. He wore a semi-military smoking jacket, claret-coloured, with a black velvet collar. In his hand he held a long legal document which he was reading in an indolent fashion, blowing rings of tobacco smoke from his lips as he did so. There was no promise of a speedy departure in his composed bearing and his comfortable attitude. I felt Holmes's hand steal into mine and give me a reassuring shake, as if to say that the situation was within his powers and that he was easy in his mind. I was not so sure whether he had seen what was only too obvious from my position, that the door of the safe was imperfectly closed, and that Milverton might at any moment observe it. In my own mind I had determined that if I were sure, from the rigidity of his gaze, that it had caught his eye, I would at once spring out, throw my greatcoat over his head, pinion him, and leave the rest to Holmes. But Milverton never looked up. He was languidly interested by the papers in his hand, and page after page was turned as he followed the arguments of the lawyer. At least, I thought, when he had finished the document and the cigar, he would go to his room. But before he had reached the end of either, there came a remarkable development which turned our thoughts into quite another channel. Several times I had observed that Milverton looked at his watch, and once he had risen and sat down again with a gesture of impatience. The idea, however, that he might have an appointment at so strange an hour never occurred to me until a faint sound reached my ears from the veranda outside. Milverton dropped his papers and sat rigid in his chair. The sound was repeated, and then came a gentle tap at the door. Milverton rose and opened it. "Well," said he curtly, "you are nearly half an hour late." So this was the explanation of the unlocked door and of the nocturnal vigil of Milverton. There was a gentle rustle of a woman's dress. I had closed the slit between the curtains as Milverton's face had turned in our direction, but now I ventured very carefully to open it once more. He had resumed his seat, his cigar still projecting at an insolent angle from the corner of his mouth. In front of him, in the full glare of the electric light, there stood a tall, slim, dark woman, a veil over her face, a mantle drawn round her chin. Her breath came quick and fast, and every inch of the lithe figure was quivering with strong emotion. "Well," said Milverton, "you've made me lose a good night's rest, my dear. I hope you proved worth it. You couldn't come any other time, eh?" The woman shook her head. "Well, if you couldn't, you couldn't. If the Countess is a hard mistress, you have your chance to get level with her now. Bless the girl, what are you shivering about? That's right. Pull yourself together. Now, let us get down to business." He took a note from the drawer of his desk. "You say that you have 5 letters which compromise the Countess d'Elberg. You want to sell them. I want to buy them. So far, so good. It only remains to fix a price. I should want to inspect the letters, of course, if they are really good specimens. Great heavens, is it you?" The woman, without a word, had raised her veil and dropped the mantle from her chin. It was a dark, handsome, clear-cut face which confronted Milverton, a face with a curved nose, strong, dark eyebrows shading hard, glittering eyes, and a straight, thin-lipped mouth set in a dangerous smile. "It is I," she said, "the woman whose life you have ruined." Milverton laughed, but fear vibrated in his voice. "You were so very obstinate," said he. "Why did you drive me to such extremities? I assure you I wouldn't hurt a fly of my own accord. But every man has his business, and what was I to do? I put the price well within your means. You would not pay. So you sent the letters to my husband, and he, the noblest gentleman that ever lived, a man whose boots I was never worthy to lace, he broke his gallant heart and died. You remember that last night when I came through that door, I begged and prayed you for mercy, and you laughed in my face, as you are trying to laugh now. Only your coward heart cannot keep your lips from twitching. Yes, you never thought to see me here again, but it was that night which taught me how I could meet you face to face and alone. Well, Charles Milverton, what have you to say?" "Don't imagine that you can bully me," said he, rising to his feet. "I've only to raise my voice, and I could call my servants and have you arrested. But I will make allowance for your natural anger. Leave the room at once as you came, and I will say no more." The woman stood with her hand buried in her bosom, and the same deadly smile on her thin lips. "You will ruin no more lives as you ruined mine. You will wring no more hearts as you wrung mine. I will free the world of a poisonous thing. Take that, you hound, and that, and that, and that." She had drawn a little gleaming revolver and emptied barrel after barrel into Milverton's body, the muzzle within 2 feet of his shirt front. He shrank away and then fell forward upon the table, coughing furiously and clawing among the papers. Then he staggered to his feet, received another shot, and rolled upon the floor. "You've done me," he cried, and lay still. The woman looked at him intently and ground her heel into his upturned face. She looked again, but there was no sound or movement. I heard a sharp rustle, the night air blew into the heated room, and the avenger was gone. No interference upon our part could have saved the man from his fate, but as the woman poured bullet after bullet into Milverton's shrinking body, I was about to spring out when I felt Holmes's cold, strong grasp upon my wrist. I understood the whole argument of that firm, restraining grip, that it was no affair of ours, that justice had overtaken a villain, that we had our own duties and our own objects which were not to be lost sight of. But hardly had the woman rushed from the room when Holmes, with swift, silent steps, was over at the other door. He turned the key in the lock. At the same instant we heard voices in the house and the sound of hurrying feet. The revolver shots had roused the household. With perfect coolness, Holmes slipped across to the safe, filled his arms with bundles of letters, and poured them all into the fire. Again and again he did it, until the safe was empty. Someone turned the handle and beat upon the outside of the door. Holmes looked swiftly round. The letter which had been the messenger of death for Milverton lay, all mottled with his blood, upon the table. Holmes tossed it among the blazing papers. Then he drew the key from the outer door, passed through after me, and locked it on the outside. "This way, Watson," said he. "We can scale the garden wall in this direction." I could not have believed that an alarm could have spread so swiftly. Looking back, the huge house was one blaze of light. The front door was open, and figures were rushing down the drive. The whole garden was alive with people, and one fellow raised a view halloa as we emerged from the veranda and followed hard at our heels. Holmes seemed to know the ground perfectly, and he threaded his way swiftly among a plantation of small trees, I close at his heels, and our foremost pursuer panting behind us. It was a 6-foot wall which barred our path, but he sprang to the top and over. As I did the same, I felt the hand of the man behind me grab at my ankle, but I kicked myself free and scrambled over a glass-strewn coping. I fell upon my face among some bushes, but Holmes had me on my feet in an instant, and together we dashed away across the huge expanse of Hampstead Heath. We had run 2 miles, I suppose, before Holmes at last halted and listened intently. All was absolute silence behind us. We had shaken off our pursuers and were safe. We had breakfasted and were smoking our morning pipe on the day after the remarkable experience which I have recorded, when Mr. Lestrade of Scotland Yard, very solemn and impressive, was ushered into our modest sitting-room. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes," said he. "Good morning. May I ask you if you are very busy just now?" "Not too busy to listen to you." "I thought that perhaps, if you had nothing particular on hand, you might care to assist us in a most remarkable case which occurred only last night at Hampstead." "Dear me," said Holmes, "what was that?" "A murder, a most dramatic and remarkable murder. I know how keen you are upon these things, and I would take it as a great favour if you would step down to Appledore Towers and give us the benefit of your advice. It is no ordinary crime. We have had our eyes upon this Mr. Milverton for some time, and between ourselves he was a bit of a villain. He is known to have held papers which he used for blackmailing purposes. These papers have all been burned by the murderers. No article of value was taken, as it is probable that the criminals were men of good position, whose sole object was to prevent social exposure." "Criminals," said Holmes, "plural?" "Yes, there were 2 of them. They were, as nearly as possible, captured red-handed. We have their footmarks, we have their description. It's 10 to 1 that we trace them. The first fellow was a bit too active, but the second was caught by the under-gardener and only got away after a struggle. He was a middle-sized, strongly built man, square jaw, thick neck, moustache and mask over his eyes. "That's rather vague," said Sherlock Holmes. "Why, it might be a description of Watson." "It's true," said the inspector with much amusement. "It might be a description of Watson." "Well, I'm afraid I can't help you, Lestrade," said Holmes. "The fact is that I knew this fellow Milverton, that I consider him one of the most dangerous men in London, and that I think there are certain crimes which the law cannot touch, and which, therefore, to some extent, justify private revenge. No, it's no use arguing. I've made up my mind. My sympathies are with the criminals rather than with the victim, and I will not handle this case." Holmes had not said one word to me about the tragedy which we had witnessed, but I observed all the morning that he was in his most thoughtful mood, and he gave me the impression, from his vacant eyes and his abstract manner, of a man who is striving to recall something to his memory. We were in the middle of our lunch when he suddenly sprang to his feet. "By Jove, Watson, I've got it!" he cried. "Take your hat. Come with me." He hurried at his top speed down Baker Street and along Oxford Street until we had almost reached Regent Circus. Here, on the left hand, there stands a shop window filled with photographs of the celebrities and beauties of the day. Holmes' eyes fixed themselves upon one of them, and following his gaze I saw the picture of a regal and stately lady in court dress, with a high diamond tiara upon her noble head. I looked at that delicately curved nose, at the marked eyebrows, at the straight mouth, and the strong little chin beneath it. Then I caught my breath as I read the time-honoured title of the great nobleman and statesman whose wife she had been. My eyes met those of Holmes, and he put his finger to his lips as we turned away from the window. End of The Adventure of Charles Augustus Milverton, by Arthur Conan Doyle. The Adventure of the Three Students, by Arthur Conan Doyle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Tomlinson. It was in the year 95 that a combination of events, into which I need not enter, caused Mr. Sherlock Holmes and myself to spend some weeks in one of our great university towns, and it was during this time that the small but instructive adventure which I am about to relate befell us. It will be obvious that any details which would help the reader to exactly identify the college or the criminal would be injudicious and offensive. So painful a scandal may well be allowed to die out. With due discretion, the incident itself may, however, be described, since it serves to illustrate some of those qualities for which my friend was remarkable. I will endeavour in my statement to avoid such terms as would serve to limit the events to any particular place or give a clue as to the people concerned. We were residing at the time in furnished lodgings close to a library where Sherlock Holmes was pursuing some laborious researches in early English charters, researches which led to results so striking that they may be the subject of one of my future narratives. Here it was that one evening we received a visit from an acquaintance, Mr. Hilton Soames, tutor and lecturer at the College of St. Luke's. Mr. Soames was a tall, spare man of a nervous and excitable temperament. I had always known him to be restless in his manner, but on this particular occasion he was in such a state of uncontrollable agitation that it was clear something very unusual had occurred. "I trust, Mr. Holmes, that you can spare me a few hours of your valuable time. We have had a very painful incident at St. Luke's, and really, but for the happy chance of you being in the town, I should have been at a loss what to do." "I am very busy just now, and I desire no distractions," my friend answered. "I should much prefer that you called in the aid of the police." No, no, my dear sir, such a course is utterly impossible. When once the law is revoked, it cannot be stayed again, and this is just one of those cases where, for the credit of the college, it is most essential to avoid scandal. Your discretion is as well known as your powers, and you are the one man in the world who can help me. I beg you, Mr. Holmes, to do what you can." My friend's temper had not improved since he had been deprived the congenial surroundings of Baker Street. Without his scrapbooks, his chemicals, and his homely untidiness, he was an uncomfortable man. He shrugged his shoulders in ungracious acquiescence, while our visitor, in hurried words and with much excitable gesticulation, poured forth his story. "I must explain to you, Mr. Holmes, that tomorrow is the first day of the examination for the Fortescue Scholarship. I am one of the examiners. My subject is Greek, and the first of the papers consists of a large passage of Greek translation which the candidate has not seen. This passage is printed on the examination paper, and it would naturally be an immense advantage if the candidate could prepare it in advance. For this reason great care is taken to keep the paper secret. Today about 3 o'clock the proofs of this paper arrived from the printers. The exercise contains of half a chapter of Thucydides. I had to read it over carefully, as the text must be absolutely correct. At 4:30 my task was not yet completed. I had, however, promised to take tea in a friend's rooms, so I left the proof upon my desk. I was absent rather more than an hour. You are aware, Mr. Holmes, that our college doors are double, a green baize one within, and a heavy oak one without. As I approached my outer door, I was amazed to see a key in it. For an instant I imagined I had left my own there, but on feeling in my pocket I found that it was all right. The only duplicate which existed, so far as I knew, was that which belonged to my servant, Bannister, a man who has looked after my room for 10 years, and whose honesty is absolutely above suspicion. I found that the key was indeed his, that he had entered my room to know if I wanted tea, and that he had very carelessly left the key in the door when he came out. His visit to my room must have been within a very few minutes of my leaving it. His forgetfulness about the key would have mattered little upon any other occasion, but on this one day it has produced the most deplorable consequences. The moment I looked at my table, I was aware that someone had rummaged among my papers. The proof was in 3 long slips. I had left them all together. Now I found that one of them was lying on the floor, one was on the side table near the window, and the third was where I had left it. Holmes stirred for the first time. "The first page on the floor, the second in the window, the third where you left it?" said he. "Exactly, Mr. Holmes. You amaze me. How could you possibly know that?" "Pray continue your very interesting statement." For an instant I imagined that Bannister had taken the unpardonable liberty of examining my papers. He denied it, however, with the utmost earnestness, and I am convinced that he was speaking the truth. The alternative was that someone passing had observed the key in the door, had known that I was out, and had entered to look at the papers. A large sum of money is at stake, for the scholarship is a very valuable one, and an unscrupulous man might very well run a risk in order to gain an advantage over his fellows. Bannister was very much upset by the incident. He had nearly fainted when we found that the papers had undoubtedly been tampered with. I gave him a little brandy and left him collapsed in a chair while I made a most careful examination of the room. I soon saw that the intruder had left other traces of his presence besides the rumpled papers. On the table in the window there were several shreds from a pencil which had been sharpened. A broken tip of lead was lying there also. Evidently the rascal had copied the paper in a great hurry, had broken his pencil, and had been compelled to put a fresh point to it. "Excellent," said Holmes, who was recovering his good humour as his attention became more engrossed by the case. "Fortune has been your friend." This was not all. I have a new writing table with a fine surface of red leather. I am prepared to swear, and so is Bannister that it was smooth and unstained. Now I find a clean cut in it about 3 inches long, not a mere scratch, but a positive cut. Not only this, but on the table I found a small ball of black dough or clay with specks of something which looks like sawdust in it. I am convinced that these marks were left by the man who rifled the papers. There were no footmarks and no other evidence as to his identity. I was at my wits' ends when suddenly the happy thought occurred to me that you were in the town, and I came straight round to put the matter into your hands. Do help me, Mr. Holmes. You see my dilemma. Either I must find the man, or else the examination must be postponed until fresh papers are prepared. And since this cannot be done without explanation, there will ensue a hideous scandal, which will throw a cloud not only on the college but on the university. Above all things, I desire to settle the matter quietly and discreetly. I shall be happy to look into it, to give you such advice as I can, said Holmes, rising and putting on his overcoat. The case is not entirely devoid of interest. Had anyone visited you in your room after the papers came to you? Yes, young Darlat Ras, an Indian student who lives on the same stair, came in to ask me some particulars about the examination. For which he was entered? Yes. And the papers were on your table? To the best of my belief they were rolled up, but might be recognized as proofs? Possibly. No one else in your room? No. Did anyone know that these proofs would be there? No one save the printer. Did this man Bannister know? No, certainly not. No one knew. Where is Bannister now? He was very ill, poor fellow. I left him collapsed in the chair. I was in such a hurry to come to you. You left your door open? I locked up the papers first. Then it amounts to this, Mr. Soames, that unless the Indian student recognized the roll as being proofs, the man who tampered with them came upon them accidentally without knowing that they were there. So it seems to me. Holmes gave an enigmatic smile. Well, said he, let us go round. Not one of your cases, Watson. Mental, not physical. All right. Come if you want to. Now, Mr. Soames, at your disposal. The sitting-room of our client opened by a long, low, latticed window onto the ancient lichen-tinted court of the old college. A Gothic arched door led to a worn stone staircase. On the ground floor was the tutor's room. Above were 3 students, one on each story. It was already twilight when we reached the scene of our problem. Holmes halted and looked earnestly at the window. Then he approached it, and standing on tiptoe with his neck craned, he looked into the room. He must have entered through the door. There is no opening except the one pane, said our learned guide. Dear me, said Holmes, and he smiled in a singular way as he glanced at our companion. Well, if there is nothing to be learned here, we had best go inside. The lecturer unlocked the outer door and ushered us into his room. We stood at the entrance while Holmes made an examination of the carpet. I'm afraid there are no signs here, said he. One could hardly hope for any upon so dry a day. Your servant seems to have quite recovered. You left him in a chair, you say? Which chair? By the window there. I see, near this little table. You can come in now. I have finished with the carpet. Let us take the little table first. Of course, what has happened is very clear. The man entered and took the papers, sheet by sheet, from the central table. He carried them over to the window table, because from there he could see if you came across the courtyard, and so could effect an escape. As a matter of fact, he could not, said Soames, for I entered by the side door. Ah, that's good. Well, anyhow, that was in his mind. Let me see the 3 strips. No finger impressions? No. Well, he carried over this one first and he copied it. How long would it take him to do that, using every possible contraction? A quarter of an hour, not less. Then he tossed it down and seized the next. He was in the midst of that when your return caused him to make a very hurried retreat. Very hurried, since he had not time to replace the papers which would tell you that he had been there. You are not aware of any hurrying feet on the stair as you entered the outer door? No, I can't say I was. Well, he wrote so furiously that he broke his pencil and had, as you observe, to sharpen it again. This is of interest, Watson. The pencil was not an ordinary one. It was above the usual size, with a soft lead. The outer colour was dark blue, the maker's name was printed in silver lettering, and the piece remaining is only about 1.5 inches long. Look for such a pencil, Mr. Soames, and you have got your man. When I add that he possesses a large and very blunt knife, you have an additional aid." Mr. Soames was somewhat overwhelmed by this flood of information. "I can follow the other points," said he, "but really, in this matter of the length—" Holmes held out a small chip with the letters NN and a space of clear wood after them. "You see? No, I fear that even now— Watson, I've always done you an injustice. There are others. What could this NN be?" "It is at the end of a word. You are aware that Johann Faber is the most common maker's name. It is not clear that there is just as much of the pencil left as usually follows the Johann." He held the small table sideways to the electric light. "I was hoping that if the paper on which he wrote was thin, some trace of it might come through upon this polished surface. No, I see nothing. I don't think there is anything more to be learned here. Now for the central table. This small pellet is, I presume, the black, doughy mass you spoke of. Roughly pyramidal in shape and hollowed out, I perceive. As you say, there appear to be grains of sawdust in it. Dear me, this is very interesting. And the cut, a positive tear, I see. It began with a thin scratch and ended in a jagged hole. I am much indebted to you for directing my attention to this case, Mr. Soames. Where does that door lead to?" "To my bedroom." "Have you been in it since your adventure?" "No, I came straight away for you." "I should like to have a glance round. What a charming old-fashioned room. Perhaps you will kindly wait a minute until I examine the floor. No, I see nothing. What about this curtain? You hang your clothes behind it. If anyone were forced to conceal himself in this room, he must do it there, since the bed is too low and the wardrobe too shallow. No one there, I suppose." As Holmes drew the curtain, I was aware, from some little rigidity and alertness of his attitude, that he was prepared for an emergency. As a matter of fact, the drawn curtain disclosed nothing but 3 or 4 suits of clothes hanging from a line of pegs. Holmes turned away and stooped suddenly to the floor. "Hallo! What's this?" said he. It was a small pyramid of black, putty-like stuff, exactly like the one upon the table of the study. Holmes held out his open palm in the glare of the electric light. "Your visitor seems to have left traces in your bedroom as well as in your sitting-room, Mr. Soames." "What could he have wanted there?" "I think it is clear enough. You came back by an unexpected way, and so he had no warning until you were at the very door. What could he do? He caught up everything which would betray him, and he rushed into your bedroom to conceal himself." "Good gracious, Mr. Holmes, do you mean to tell me that all the time I was talking to Bannister in this room we had the man prisoner if we had only known it?" "So I read it. Surely there is another alternative, Mr. Holmes. I don't know whether you observed my bedroom window." "Lattice-paned, lead framework, 3 separate windows, one swinging on hinge and large enough to admit a man." "Exactly, and it looks out on an angle of the courtyard so as to be partly invisible. The man might have effected his entrance there, left traces as he passed through the bedroom, and finally, finding the door open, have escaped that way." Holmes shook his head impatiently. "Let us be practical," he said. "I understand you say that there are 3 students who use this stair and are in the habit of passing your door." "Yes, there are." "And they are all in for this examination?" "Yes." "Have you any reason to suspect any one of them more than the others?" Soames hesitated. "It is a very delicate question," said he. "One hardly likes to throw suspicion where there are no proofs." Let us hear the suspicions. I will look after the proofs. I will tell you then, in a few words, the character of the three men who inhabit these rooms. The lower of the three is Gilchrist, a fine scholar and athlete, plays in the rugby team and the cricket team for the college, and got his blue for the hurdles and the long jump. He is a fine, manly fellow. His father was the notorious Sir Jabez Gilchrist, who ruined himself on the turf. My scholar has been left very poor, but he is hard-working and industrious. He will do very well. The second floor is inhabited by Dalat Ras, the Indian. He is a quiet, inscrutable fellow, as most of those Indians are. He is well up in his work, though Greek is his weak subject. He is steady and methodical. The top floor belongs to Miles Maclaren. He is a brilliant fellow when he chooses to work, one of the brightest intellects of the university, but he is wayward, dissipated, and unprincipled. He was nearly expelled over a card scandal in his first year. He has been idling all this term, and he must look forward with dread to the examination. Then it is he whom you suspect. I dare not go so far as to say that, but of the three he is perhaps the least unlikely. Exactly. Now, Mr. Soames, let us look at your servant Bannister. He was a little, white-faced, clean-shaven, grizzly-haired fellow of 50. He was still suffering from this sudden disturbance of the quiet routine of his life. His plump face was twitching with his nervousness, and his fingers could not keep still. "We are investigating this unhappy business, Bannister," said his master. "Yes, sir." "I understand," said Holmes, "that you left your key in the door." "Yes, sir." "Was it not very extraordinary that you should do this on the very day when there were these papers inside?" "It was most unfortunate, sir, but I have occasionally done the same thing at other times." "When did you enter the room?" "It was about 4:30. That is Mr. Soames's tea time." "How long did you stay?" "When I saw that he was absent, I withdrew at once." "Did you look at these papers on the table?" "No, sir, certainly not." "How came you to leave the key in the door?" "I had the tea tray in my hand. I thought I would come back for the key. Then I forgot." "Has the outer door a spring lock?" "No, sir." "Then it was open all the time?" "Yes, sir." "Anyone in the room could get out?" "Yes, sir." "When Mr. Soames returned and called for you, you were very much disturbed?" "Yes, sir. Such a thing has never happened during the many years that I have been here. I nearly fainted, sir." "So I understand. Where were you when you began to feel bad?" "Where was I, sir?" "Why, here, near the door." "That is singular, because you sat down in that chair over yonder near the corner. Why did you pass these outer chairs?" "I don't know, sir. It didn't matter to me where I sat." "I really don't think he knew much about it, Mr. Holmes. He was looking very bad, quite ghastly." "You stayed here when your master left?" "Only for a moment or so. Then I locked the door and went to my room." "Whom do you suspect?" "Oh, I would not venture to say, sir. I don't believe there is any gentleman in this university who is capable of profiting by such an action. No, sir, I'll not believe it." "Thank you, that will do," said Holmes. "Oh, one more word. You have not mentioned to any of the three gentlemen whom you attend that anything is amiss?" "No, sir, not a word." "You haven't seen any of them?" "No, sir." "Very good. Now, Mr. Soames, we will take a walk in the quadrangle, if you please." 3 yellow squares of light shone above us in the gathering gloom. "Your 3 birds are all in their nests," said Holmes, looking up. "Halloa! What's that? One of them seems restless enough." It was the Indian, whose dark silhouette appeared suddenly upon his blind. He was pacing swiftly up and down his room. "I should like to have a peep at each of them," said Holmes. "Is it possible?" "No difficulty in the world," Soames answered. "This set of rooms is quite the oldest in the college, and it is not unusual for visitors to go over them. Come along, and I will personally conduct you." "No names, please," said Holmes as we knocked on Gilchrist's door. A tall, flaxen-haired, slim young fellow opened it and made us welcome when he understood our errand. There were some really curious pieces of medieval domestic architecture within. Holmes was so charmed with one of them that he insisted on drawing it on his notebook, broke his pencil, had to borrow one from our host, and finally borrowed a knife to sharpen his own. The same curious accident happened to him in the rooms of the Indian, a silent, little, hook-nosed fellow, who eyed us askance and was obviously glad when Holmes's architectural studies had come to an end. I could not see that in either case Holmes had come upon the clue for which he was searching. Only at the third did our visit prove abortive. The outer door would not open to our knock, and nothing more substantial than a torrent of bad language came from behind it. "I don't care who you are. You can go to blazes," roared the angry voice. "Tomorrow's the exam, and I won't be drawn by anyone." "A rude fellow," said our guide, flushing with anger as we withdrew down the stair. Of course, he did not realize that it was I who was knocking, but none the less his conduct was very uncourteous, and, indeed, under the circumstances, rather suspicious. Holmes's response was a curious one. "Can you tell me his exact height?" he asked. "Really, Mr. Holmes, I cannot undertake to say. He is taller than the Indian, not so tall as Gilchrist. I suppose 5'6" would be about it." "That is very important," said Holmes. "And now, Mr. Soames, I wish you good night." Our guide cried aloud in his astonishment and dismay. "Good gracious, Mr. Holmes, you are surely not going to leave me in this abrupt fashion. You don't seem to realize the position. Tomorrow is the examination. I must take some definite action tonight. I cannot allow the examinations to be held if one of the papers has been tampered with. The situation must be faced." "You must leave it as it is. I shall drop around early tomorrow morning and chat the matter over. It is possible that I may be in a position then to indicate some course of action. Meanwhile, you change nothing, nothing at all." "Very good, Mr. Holmes. You can be perfectly easy in your mind. We shall certainly find some way out of your difficulties. I will take the black clay with me, also the pencil cuttings. Good-bye." When we were out in the darkness of the quadrangle, we again looked up at the windows. The Indian still paced his room. The others were invisible. "Well, Watson, what do you think of it?" Holmes asked, as we came out into the main street. "Quite a little parlour game. Sort of three-card trick, is it not? There are your three men. It must be one of them. You take your choice. Which is yours?" "The foul-mouthed fellow at the top. He is the one with the worst record, and yet the Indian was a sly fellow also. Why should he be pacing his room all the time? There is nothing in that. Many men do it when they are trying to learn anything by heart." He looked at us in a queer way. "So would you if a flock of strangers came in on you when you were preparing for an examination next day, and every moment was of value." "No, I see nothing in that. Pencils, too, and knives, all was satisfactory. But that fellow does puzzle me." "Who?" "Why, Bannister, the servant. What's his game in the matter?" "He impressed me as being a perfectly honest man." "So he did me. That is the puzzling part. Why should a perfectly honest man— Well, here's a large stationer's. We shall begin our researches here." There were only 4 stationers of any consequence in the town, and at each Holmes produced his pencil chips and bid high for a duplicate. All were agreed that one could be ordered, but that it was not a usual size of pencil, and that it was seldom kept in stock. My friend did not appear to be depressed by his failure, but shrugged his shoulders in half-humorous resignation. "No good, my dear Watson. This, the best and only final clue, has run to nothing. But indeed I have little doubt that we can build up a sufficient case without it. By Jove, my dear fellow, it is nearly 9, and the landlady babbled of green peas at 7:30. What with your eternal tobacco, Watson, and your irregularity at meals, I expect that you will get notice to quit, and I shall share your downfall. Not, however, before we have solved the problem of the nervous tutor, the careless servant, and the 3 enterprising students." Holmes made no further allusion to the matter that day, though he sat lost in thought for a long time after our belated dinner. At 8 in the morning he came into my room just as I was finishing my toilet. "Well, Watson," said he, "it is time we went down to St. Luke's. Can you do without breakfast?" "Certainly." "Soames will be in a dreadful fidget until we are able to tell him something positive." "Have you anything positive to tell him?" "I think so." "You have formed a conclusion?" "Yes, my dear Watson, I have solved the mystery." "But what fresh evidence could you have got?" "Aha! It is not for nothing that I have turned myself out of bed at the untimely hour of 6. I have put in 2 hours' hard work and covered at least 5 miles, with something to show for it. Look at that." He held out his hand. On the palm were 3 little pyramids of black, doughy clay. "Why, Holmes, you had only 2 yesterday." "And 1 more this morning. It is a fair argument that wherever number 3 came from is also the source of numbers 1 and 2. Eh, Watson? Well, come along and put friend Soames out of his pain." The unfortunate tutor was certainly in a state of pitiable agitation when we found him in his chambers. In a few hours the examination would commence, and he was still in the dilemma between making the facts public and allowing the culprit to compete for the valuable scholarship. He could hardly stand still, so great was his mental agitation, and he ran towards Holmes with 2 eager hands outstretched. "Thank heaven you have come. I feared you had given it up in despair. What am I to do? Shall the examination proceed?" "Yes, let it proceed by all means." "But this rascal—" "He shall not compete." "You know him?" "I think so. If this matter is not to become public, we must give ourselves certain powers and resolve ourselves into a small private court-martial. You there, if you please, Soames. Watson, you here. I'll take the armchair in the middle. I think that we are now sufficiently imposing to strike terror into a guilty beast. Kindly ring the bell." Bannister entered and shrunk back in evident surprise and fear at our judicial appearance. "You will kindly close the door," said Holmes. "Now, Bannister, will you please tell us the truth about yesterday's incident?" The man turned white to the roots of his hair. "I have told you everything, sir." "Nothing to add?" "Nothing at all, sir." "Well, then I must make some suggestions to you. When you sat down on that chair yesterday, did you do so in order to conceal some object which would have shown who had been in the room?" Bannister's face was ghastly. "No, sir, certainly not." "It is only a suggestion," said Holmes suavely. "I frankly admit that I am unable to prove it. But it seems probable enough, since the moment that Mr. Soames's back was turned, you released the man who was hiding in that bedroom." Bannister licked his dry lips. "There was no man, sir." "Ah, that's a pity, Bannister. Up to now you may have spoken the truth, but now I know that you have lied." The man's face set in sullen defiance. "There was no man, sir." "Come, come, Bannister." "No, sir, there was no one." "In that case you can give us no further information. Would you please remain in the room? Stand over there near the bedroom door. Now, Soames, I am going to ask you to have the great kindness to go up to the room of young Gilchrist and ask him to step down into yours." An instant later the tutor returned, bringing with him the student. He was a fine figure of a man, tall, lithe, and agile, with a springy step and a pleasant, open face. His troubled blue eyes glanced at each of us, and finally rested with an expression of blank dismay upon Bannister in the farther corner. "Just close the door," said Holmes. "Now, Mr. Gilchrist, we are all quite alone here, and no one need ever know one word of what passes between us. We can be perfectly frank with each other. We want to know, Mr. Gilchrist, how you, an honourable man, ever came to commit such an action as that of yesterday." The unfortunate young man staggered back and cast a look full of horror and reproach at Bannister. "No, no, Mr. Gilchrist, sir, I never said a word, never one word," cried the servant. "No, but you have now," said Holmes. "Now, sir, you must see that after Bannister's words your position is hopeless, and that your only chance lies in a frank confession." For a moment Gilchrist, with upraised hand, tried to control his writhing features. The next he had thrown himself on his knees beside the table and, burying his face in his hands, he had burst into a storm of passionate sobbing. "Come, come," said Holmes kindly. "It is human to err, and at least no one can accuse you of being a callous criminal. Perhaps it would be easier for you if I were to tell Mr. Soames what occurred, and you can check me where I am wrong. Shall I do so? Well, well, don't trouble to answer. Listen and see that I do you no injustice. From the moment, Mr. Soames, that you said to me that no one, not even Bannister, could have told that the papers were in your room, the case began to take a definite shape in my mind. The printer one could, of course, dismiss. He could examine the papers in his own office. The Indian I also thought nothing of. If the proofs were in a roll, he could not possibly know what they were. On the other hand, it seemed an unthinkable coincidence that a man should dare to enter the room, and that by chance, on that very day, the papers were on the table. I dismissed that. The man who entered knew the papers were there. How did he know? When I approached your room, I examined the window. You amused me by supposing that I was contemplating the possibility of someone having, in broad daylight, under the eyes of all these opposite rooms, forced himself through it. Such an idea was absurd. I was measuring how tall a man would need to be in order to see, as he passed, what papers were on the central table. I am 6 feet high, and I could do it with an effort. No one less than that would have a chance. Already, you see, I had reason to think that if one of your 3 students was a man of unusual height, he was the most worth watching of the 3. I entered and took you into my confidence as to the suggestions of the side table. Of the centre table I could make nothing, until in your description of Gilchrist you mentioned that he was a long-distance jumper. Then the whole thing came to me in an instant, and I only needed certain corroborative proofs, which I speedily obtained. What happened was this. This young fellow had employed his afternoon at the athletic grounds, where he had been practising the jump. He returned carrying his jumping shoes, which are provided, as you are aware, with several sharp spikes. As he passed your window he saw, by means of his great height, these proofs open upon your table, and conjectured what they were. No harm would have been done had it not been that as he passed your door he perceived the key which had been left by the carelessness of your servant. A sudden impulse came over him to enter and see if they were the proofs. It was not a dangerous exploit, for he could always pretend that he had simply looked in to ask a question. Well, when he saw that they were indeed the proofs, it was then that he yielded to the temptation. He put his shoes on the table. What was it you put on that chair near the window? Gloves, said the young man. Holmes looked triumphantly at Bannister. He put his gloves on the chair, and he took the proofs, sheet by sheet, to copy them. He thought the tutor must return by the main gate, and that he would see him. As we know, he came back by the side gate. Suddenly he heard him at the very door. There was no positive escape. He forgot his gloves, but he caught up his shoes and darted into the bedroom. You observe that the scratch on the table is slight at one side, but deepens in the direction of the bedroom door. That in itself is enough to show us that the shoe had been drawn in that direction, and that the culprit had taken refuge there. The earth round the spike had been left on the table, and a second sample was loosened and fell in the bedroom. I may add that I walked out to the athletic grounds this morning, saw that tenacious black clay is used in the jumping pit, and carried away a specimen of it, together with some of the fine tan or sawdust which is strewn over it to prevent the athlete from slipping. Have I told the truth, Mr. Gilchrist?" The student had drawn himself erect. "Yes, sir, it is true," said he. "Good heavens! Have you nothing to add?" cried Soames. "Yes, sir, I have, but the shock of this disgraceful exposure has bewildered me. I have a letter here, Mr. Soames, which I wrote to you early this morning in the middle of a restless night. It was before I knew my sin had found me out. Here it is, sir. You will see that I have said I have determined not to go in for the examination. I have been offered a commission in the Rhodesian police, and I am going out to South Africa at once." "I am indeed pleased to hear that you did not intend to profit by your unfair advantage," said Soames. "But why did you change your purpose?" Gilchrist pointed at Bannister. "There is the man who set me in the right path," said he. "Come now, Bannister," said Holmes, "it will be clear to you from what I have said that only you could have let this young man out, since you were left in the room, and must have locked the door when you went out. As to his escaping by that window, it was incredible. Can you not clear up the last point in this mystery, and tell us the reasons for your action?" "It was simple enough, sir, if you only had known, but with all your cleverness it was impossible that you could know. Time was, sir, when I was a butler to old Sir Jabez Gilchrist, this young gentleman's father. When he was ruined I came to the college as servant, but I never forgot my old employer because he was down in the world. I watched his son all I could for the sake of the old days. Well, sir, when I came into this room yesterday, when the alarm was given, the very first thing I saw was Mr. Gilchrist's tan gloves lying in that chair. I knew those gloves well, and I understood their message. If Mr. Soames saw them, the game was up. I flopped down into the chair, and nothing would budge me until Mr. Soames he went for you. Then out came my poor young master, whom I had dandled on my knee, and confessed it all to me. Wasn't it natural, sir, that I should save him? And wasn't it natural also that I should try to speak to him as his dead father would have done, and make him understand that he could not profit by such a deed? Could you blame me, sir?" "No, indeed," said Holmes, heartily, springing to his feet. "Well, Soames, I think we have cleared your little problem up, and our breakfast awaits us at home. Come, Watson. As to you, sir, I trust that a bright future awaits you in Rhodesia. For once you have fallen low, let us see in the future how high you can rise." End of The Adventure of the Three Students.
Ancient Lights by Algernon Blackwood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Dan Gurzinski. Ancient Lights by Algernon Blackwood. From Southwater, where he left the train, the road led due west. That he knew. For the rest, he trusted to luck, being one of those born walkers who dislike asking the way. He had that instinct, and as a rule it served him well. A mile or so due west along the sandy road, till you come to a stile on the right, then across the fields. You'll see the Red House straight before you. He glanced at the postcard's instructions once again, and once again he tried to decipher the scratched-out sentence without success. It had been so elaborately inked over that no word was legible. Inked-out sentences in a letter were always enticing. He wondered what it was that had to be so very carefully obliterated. The afternoon was boisterous, with a tearing, shouting wind that blew from the sea across the Sussex Weald. Massive clouds, with rounded, piled-up edges, cannoned across gaping spaces of blue sky. Far away the line of downs swept the horizon like an arriving wave. Chanctonbury Ring rode their crest, a scudding ship, hull down before the wind. He took his hat off and walked rapidly, breathing great draughts of air with delight and exhilaration. The road was deserted. No horsemen, bicycles, or motors, not even a tradesman's cart, no single walker. But anyhow, he would never have asked the way. Keeping a sharp eye for the stile, he pounded along, while the wind tossed the cloak against his face and made waves across the blue puddles in the yellow road. The trees showed their underleaves of white, the bracken and the high new grass, bent all one way. Great life was in the day, high spirits, and dancing everywhere. And for a Croydon surveyor's clerk just out of an office, this was like a holiday at the sea. It was a day for high adventure, and his heart rose up to meet the mood of nature. His umbrella with the silver ring ought to have been a sword, and his brown shoes should have been top boots with spurs upon the heels. Where hid the enchanted castle and the princess with the hair of sunny gold? His horse? The stile came suddenly into view and nipped adventure in the bud. Everyday clothes took him prisoner again. He was a surveyor's clerk, middle-aged, earning £3 a week, coming from Croydon to see about a client's proposed alterations in a wood. Something to ensure a better view from the dining-room window. Across the fields, perhaps a mile away, he saw the red house gleaming in the sunshine, and resting on the stile a moment to get his breath, he noticed a copse of oak and hornbeam on the right. Aha, he told himself, so that must be the wood he wants to cut down to improve the view. I'll have a look at it. There were boards up, of course, but there was an inviting little path as well. I'm not a trespasser, he said. It's part of my business, this is. He scrambled awkwardly over the gate and entered the copse. A little round would bring him to the field again. But the moment he passed among the trees, the wind ceased shouting, and a stillness dropped upon the world. So dense was the growth that the sunshine only came through in isolated patches. The air was close. He mopped his forehead and put his green felt hat on, but a low branch knocked it off again at once, and as he stooped, an elastic twig swung back and stung his face. There were flowers along both edges of the little path. Glades opened on either side. Ferns curved about in damper corners, and the smell of earth and foliage was rich and sweet. It was cooler here. What an enchanting little wood, he thought, turning down a small green glade where the sunshine flickered like silver wings. How it danced and fluttered and moved about! He put a dark blue flower in his buttonhole. Again his hat, caught by an oak branch as he rose, was knocked from his head, falling across his eyes, and this time he did not put it on again. Swinging his umbrella, he walked on with uncovered head, whistling rather loudly as he went. But the thickness of the trees hardly encouraged whistling, and something of his gaiety and high spirits seemed to leave him. He suddenly found himself treading circumspectly and with caution. The stillness in the wood was so peculiar. There was a rustle among the ferns and leaves, and something shot across the path 10 yards ahead, stopped abruptly an instant with head cocked sideways to stare, then dived again beneath the underbrush with the speed of a shadow. He started like a frightened child, laughing the next second that a mere pheasant could have made him jump. In the distance he heard wheels upon the road, and wondered why the sound was pleasant. Good old butcher's cart, he said to himself, then realized that he was going in the wrong direction, and had somehow got turned round, for the road should be behind him, not in front. And he hurriedly took another narrow glade that lost itself in greenness to the right. That's my direction, of course, he said. The trees has mixed me up a bit, it seems. Then found himself abruptly by the gate he had first climbed over. He had merely made a circle. Surprise became almost discomfiture then, and a man, dressed like a gamekeeper in browny green, leaned against the gate, hitting his legs with a switch. I'm making for Mr. Lumley's farm, explained the walker. This is his wood, I believe. then stopped dead, because it was no man at all, but merely an effect of light and shade and foliage. He stepped back to reconstruct the singular illusion, but the wind shook the branches roughly here on the edge of the wood, and the foliage refused to reconstruct the figure. The leaves all rustled strangely, and just then the sun went behind a cloud, making the whole wood look otherwise. Yet how the mind could be thus doubly deceived was indeed remarkable, for it almost seemed to him the man had answered, spoken, or was this the shuffling noise the branches made? And had pointed with his switch to the notice board upon the nearest tree. The words rang on in his head. Of course he had imagined them. "No, it's not his wood, it's ours." And some village wit, moreover, had changed the lettering on the weather-beaten board, for it read quite plainly, "Trespassers will be persecuted." And while the astonished clerk read the words and chuckled, he said to himself, thinking, what a tale he'd have to tell his wife and children later. The blooming wood has tried to chuck me out, but I'll go in again. Why, it's only a matter of a square acre at most. I'm bound to reach the fields on the other side if I keep straight on. He remembered his position in the office. He had a certain dignity to maintain. The cloud passed from below the sun, and light splashed suddenly in all manner of unlikely places. The man went straight on. He felt a touch of puzzling confusion somewhere. This way the cops had of shifting from sunshine into shadow doubtless troubled sight a little. To his relief at last, a new glade opened through the trees and disclosed the fields, with a glimpse of the red house in the distance at the far end. But a little wicket gate that stood across the path had first to be climbed, and as he scrambled heavily over, for it would not open, he got the astonishing feeling that it slid off sideways beneath his weight and toward the wood. Like the moving staircases at Herod's and Earl's Court, it began to glide off with him. It was quite horrible. He made a violent effort to get down before it carried him into the trees, but his feet became entangled with the bars and umbrella, so that he fell heavily upon the far side, arms spread across the grass and nettles, boots clutched between the first and second bars. He lay there a moment like a man crucified upside down, and while he struggled to get disentangled, feet, bars, and umbrella formed a regular net. He saw the little man in browny green go past him with extreme rapidity through the wood. The man was laughing. He passed across the glade some 50 yards away, and he was not alone this time. A companion like himself went with him. The clerk, now upon his feet again, watched them disappear into the gloom of green beyond. "They're tramps, not gamekeepers," he said to himself, half mortified, half angry. But his heart was thumping dreadfully, and he dared not utter all his thought. He examined the wicket gate, convinced it was a trick gate somehow, then went hurriedly on again, disturbed beyond belief to see that the glade no longer opened into fields, but curved away to the right. What in the world had happened to him? His sight was so utterly at fault. Again the sun flamed out abruptly and lit the floor of the wood with pools of silver, and at the same moment a violent gust of wind passed shouting overhead. Drops fell clattering everywhere upon the leaves, making a sharp pattering as of many footsteps. The whole copse shuddered and went moving. "Rain, by George," thought the clerk, and feeling for his umbrella, discovered he had lost it. He turned back to the gate and found it lying on the farther side. To his amazement, he saw the fields at the far end of the glade. The red house, too, a shine in the sunset. He laughed then, for of course, in his struggle with the gate, he had somehow got turned round, had fallen back instead of forwards. Climbing over, this time quite easily, he retraced his steps. The silver band he saw had been torn from the umbrella. No doubt his foot, a nail, or something had caught in it and ripped it off. The clerk began to run. He felt extraordinarily dismayed, but while he ran, the entire wood ran with him, round him, to and fro, trees shifting like living things, leaves folding and unfolding, trunks darting backwards and forwards, and branches disclosing enormous empty spaces, then closing up again before he could look into them. There were footsteps everywhere, and laughing, crying voices, and crowds of figures gathering just behind his back, till the glade, he knew, was thick with moving life. The wind in his ears, of course, produced the voices and the laughter, while sun and clouds, plunging the copse alternately in shadow and bright dazzling light, created the figures. But he did not like it, and went as fast as ever his sturdy legs could take him. He was frightened now. This was no story for his wife and children. He ran like the wind, but his feet made no sound upon the soft mossy turf. Then, to his horror, he saw that the glade grew narrow. Nettles and weeds stood thick across it. It dwindled down into a tiny path, and 20 yards ahead it stopped finally and melted off among the trees. What the trick gate had failed to achieve, this twisting glade accomplished easily, carried him in bodily among the dense and crowding trees. There was only one thing to do: turn sharply and dash back again, run headlong into the life that followed at his back, followed so closely, too, that now it almost touched him, pushing him in. And with reckless courage, this was what he did. It seemed a fearful thing to do. He turned with a sort of violent spring, head down and shoulders forward, hands stretched before his face. He made the plunge. Like a hunted creature, he charged full tilt the other way, meeting the wind now in his face. Good Lord, the gate behind him had closed up as well. There was no longer any path at all. Turning round and round like an animal at bay, he searched for an opening, a way of escape, searched frantically, breathlessly, terrified now in his bones. But foliage surrounded him, branches blocked the way. The trees stood close and still, unshaken by a breath of wind, and the sun dipped that moment behind a great black cloud. The entire wood turned dark and silent. It watched him. Perhaps it was this final touch of sudden blackness that made him act so foolishly, as though he had really lost his head. At any rate, without pausing to think, he dashed headlong in among the trees again. There was a sensation of being stiflingly surrounded and entangled, and that he must break out at all costs, out and away into the open of the blessed fields and air. He did this ill-considered thing, and apparently charged straight into an oak that deliberately moved onto his path to stop him. He saw it shift across a good full yard, and being a measuring man, accustomed to theodolite and chain, he ought to know. He fell, saw stars, and felt 1,000 tiny fingers tugging and pulling at his hands and neck and ankles. The stinging nettles, no doubt, were responsible for this. He thought of it later. At the moment, it felt diabolically calculated. But another remarkable illusion was not so easily explained. For all in a moment, it seemed, the entire wood went sliding past him, with a thick, deep rustling of leaves and laughter, myriad footsteps and tiny little active, energetic shapes. 2 men in browny green gave him a mighty hoist, and he opened his eyes to find himself lying in the meadow beside the stile where first his incredible adventure had begun. The wood stood in its usual place and stared down upon him in the sunlight. There was the red house in the distance as before. Above him grinned the weather-beaten notice-board. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Disheveled in mind and body, and a good deal shaken in his official soul, the clerk walked slowly across the fields. But on the way he glanced once more at the postcard of instructions, and saw with dull amazement that the inked-out sentence was quite legible after all beneath the scratches made across it. "There is a short-cut through the wood I want cut down, if you care to take it." Only care was so badly written it looked more like another word. The C was uncommonly like D. "That's the copse that spoils my view of the downs, you see." his client explained to him later, pointing across the fields and referring to the ordnance map beside him. "I want it cut down and a path made so and so." His finger indicated direction on the map. "The fairy wood, it's still called, and it's far older than this house. Come now, if you're ready, Mr. Thomas, we might go out and have a look at it." End of Ancient Lights by Algernon Blackwood.